There are a lot of people that I talk with who deconstruct and just get disillusioned, I think is a good word.
Right. So here's how they view the church. Hypocritical, focus too much on converting people, anti-homosexual, too political, too judgmental.
And it's not just that Christians hold certain political views. It's often how they hold those views, why they hold those views, and how they treat people who hold different views. That's often a big piece behind it.
Yeah. Welcome to Homeward. I'm Jim Burns. Let's be honest. There are a number of Christians, especially young people, who are leaving the church. They're violating their parents' values. They're deconstructing. We're going to talk about that word because there's a lot of confusion around that word today. They're drifting. And many call this drifting, like I said, deconstruction. Well, today we have got one of my favorite communicators. His name is Dr. Sean McDowell. I've actually known him for a long, long time. I mean, he was like a little kid kind of chasing around with his dad, and there he was. I respect him deeply, and I think he's actually one of the most gifted communicators I know, and I mean that with all my heart. You don't hear me say that a lot on the Homeward broadcast. Well, maybe never. Sean and John Marriott wrote a great book called Set Adrift. And I read that book last week, and some of the questions are going to come from there. Some are just coming out. He also just has put out a new version of the book, More Than a Carpenter. His dad was famous for writing that book, and it was a very special book in my life. I mean, it rocked my world in a beautiful way. And anyway, this version has just come out with Sean's edition. I have told people, and I probably shouldn't say this on the air, but that I think Sean is actually more articulate than his dad, and I think his dad's articulate. So anyway, I love his dad, okay? He is an associate professor of Christian Apologetics at Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. Don't let that scare you either, because he's a professor and he's really, really smart, but he doesn't come across that way, okay? So you'll be okay with that. And like I said, I think he's one of the top leaders right now in the country, and I just appreciate him so much. I actually stock his podcast. I'm on his website, seanmcdowell.org, and he just does a great job. Big day was in April of 2000. He married his high school sweetheart. I mean, how many people actually do that? Stephanie, and they have 3 kids. But here's the biggie. So a lot of people don't know this, but he actually was the captain of the basketball team at Biola University. 30-7 they went that year. So why didn't you? Welcome, first of all.
Thank you.
Good to have you. Why didn't you go MBA?
Oh, my goodness. I walked on the team and sat the bench 3 years and was scraping for every minute.
Yeah.
So that was – I've actually – in my job right now, I've told my wife, I said, there's only one job I do on the planet is if the Spurs needed a point guard, which basically means there's nobody who's going to be calling, I'm stuck with this job.
Yeah. Well, plus some of the point guards today are like 6'4".
Oh, my goodness. The game, the size and athleticism is unbelievable.
Isn't it amazing how it changed? I actually played high school basketball. I played high school football. I played high school baseball. Today, I couldn't make the intramural team. Well, of course, at my age. But honestly, it's just changed so much. And you couldn't ever play all 3 of those sports at one time, but I did that in high school, and I played golf at college.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Really, my story was I had become a Christian, and it freaked my dad out. And so he go, I got to get this guy straight. So he started playing golf with me. I didn't play golf. And long story short, I ended up loving the game, and I played throughout college. And then it got too expensive. I got married, and it got too expensive, and I'm not a golfer now. But anyway, though we already digress and we haven't started. So today, people, and I mentioned this in my opening, people throw around the word deconstruction a lot. I actually heard a podcast where you were talking about this, and I think many people are deconstructing their faith. They're doing it in droves. Most people, when they do that, they really are violating values. They were raised in a different place, and they're deconstructing. And so, first of all, I want you to talk about, define for us what deconstruction is, because it's so confusing. But also, you say it doesn't have to mean destruction of your faith. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's right. So the difficulty when somebody says I'm deconstructing is they can mean very different things by it.
Oh, so much.
So I've had students say to me, even students at Biola, say I'm deconstructing my faith. And my question is always, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Well, the term probably originated with Derrida, postmodern philosopher, going back 70s and 80s, which meant you would take a text and just systematically dismantle any authority behind it and kind of break it down in what's called deconstruct in a postmodern sense. That's not what we mean. Sometimes deconstruction is the same term as deconversion. When somebody says, I'm deconstructing, it basically means I'm losing my faith. I'm walking away from my faith. I'm dismantling it. And some would say that with the desire to hold on to it. Others really with the desire to lose it.
Yeah.
In many cases, and the way I use it in the book, is it's a sense of like questioning one's faith and asking, what are the beliefs that I hold that maybe come from culture, maybe come from tradition, but aren't really in the scriptures, aren't really what Jesus taught?
Right.
So it's a process of breaking down and building back up on a more firm foundation. So
and actually, there's a healthy part to that.
I think that's right.
And there's also an unhealthy faith when they keep going. And I think we're probably freaking some parents out, because some parents, when they talk to me about their adult children or even their high school kids, they're heartbroken because they see their kids going through this process. What I hear you saying is it doesn't have to be deconstruction.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And my heart goes out to these parents.
Right,
I get emails daily
Me too.
from them. And I understand, like, some of the feelings that you naturally feel like, did I fail?
Yeah.
What did I do wrong?
Right.
First off, none of us are perfect parents. And that might have nothing to do with it. There's a lot of things at play.
Yeah.
And I've been around enough to see, not all, but many kids who deconstruct come back. In fact, I had an email this morning of a fellow who lost his faith at the university.
Right.
And he's like, I'm back, and he's studying at Stanford and UCLA, and we're going to get lunch. Like, so I just say, take a deep breath, lean in, build relationship.
Right. Yeah. Have patience, keep praying, things like that. You're so right. And it's interesting that you said this goes way back. I don't tell a lot of people because I almost went to Talbot, your school, but I went to Princeton, and I was there in the 70s, and deconstruction was a word. I've said to people, that word that's now popular here in the evangelical world that you and I live in, they were talking about deconstruction. In fact, there was a guy from Biola who I went, oh, good. He's an evangelical. He had been deconstructed. He had been there a year or two longer than me, and his faith was gone in terms of, but he was still at a seminary, theological seminary. That's not all bad, but he was not the believer that he was at Biola. It's kind of interesting how that goes. So it does have some. Now you were raised in a Christian home. You have a loving mom. Your father, of course, is one of the most influential and most famous Christian leaders of the past 50 years, no doubt. But you kind of have a story as well. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Yeah, the interesting thing about telling my story is I grew up in evangelicalism, and it's like you'd hear these dramatic stories. Everybody's got to share your testimony. I was in war. I was in a gang, whatever it was.
Right.
And I always thought, like, if God's going to use me, I got to have this dramatic story. And I just never set out to do that and didn't think about this until looking back. That in a sense, when I must have been about 19 years old. I think I was a sophomore at Biola, of all places.
Right.
This new technology comes out called the internet, and we're like getting email addresses, and I'm searching along online. And a lot of the secular atheist web, this is mid to early 90s, was built upon responding to apologetics at the time, which was largely my dad's stuff.
Yeah.
So I see these doctors and lawyers and philosophers go chapter by chapter and seemingly dismantle his material. And I don't know that I would have worded it this way, Jim, but to be honest, if somebody asked me, why isn't somebody else a Christian in high school, I probably would have said, well, they just haven't read more than Carpenter. Like, how hard is it?
Right.
And all of a sudden, I'm confronted with really smart people who see the world differently. And I remember emotionally feeling the weight of that, but also intellectually going, okay, I've got to figure out for myself. So to make a long story short, I remember going with my dad. We were in Breckenridge, Colorado. And I feel like I just needed to tell him. It's beautiful. Yeah. I think it was Christmas or Thanksgiving break, whatever it was. And I remember just saying something to the effect of, Dad, I want to know what's true, but I'm just not sure I'm convinced Christianity is true. Not knowing how he'd respond. Now, you know my dad well, so this doesn't surprise you. But he just looked at me and goes, son, I think that's great. And my next thought was like, did you hear anything I just said?
Right.
And he said, as best I can remember, like, you can't live on my convictions. Yeah. If you seek after truth, I'm confident you'll follow Jesus because Jesus is the truth. Yeah. He said, only walk away if you're convinced that it's false. Wow. And that was interesting advice. Yeah. And he said something effective, my mom and I will love you no matter what. And for me at that season, that's what I needed to hear. And the funny thing is, people ask me all the time, what was it like having this counselor and apologist, your dad? I'm kind of like, he was my dad, but I kind of needed to go to other people, just like
Sure.
you need a mentor outside.
Right,
So
sure, totally.
J.B. Moreland and William Lane Craig, started reading their stuff, and I read a lot of skeptics too.
Right.
And was like, okay, now I can piece together why I'm a Christian. This makes sense to me. And then years later, I was like, oh my goodness, this story actually encourages parents whose kids have deconstructed. Because if the great apologist son questions, pretty much anybody's son or daughter
right.
will.
And it's funny because the next time I see your dad, I want to give him a kiss on the cheek. He might slap me, but just to say, way to go. Because, I love the answer. And I think as parents, what we want to do is we get toxic, or we want to, preach and lecture, and we think that's kind of the way. And sometimes we just have to say, no, take a deep breath, calm this thing down. It's normal for kids to start experimenting with behavior as teens and then into the emerging adulthood. And so it's normal to experiment sometimes with just even conversations or voices or things like that. I love what he did. There was a book a number of years ago. It was written by David Kinnaman. You probably know David, president of the Barna Group. And it was called Unchristian. And I think this was something that, this just hit me right so much, and I've thought about it with you, and I've always wanted to ask you this question. He said that research revealed that Christian young adults now, he might change it now to more Gen Z too, but Christian young adults and non-Christian young adults kind of viewed the church the same. And I think what I see, sometimes people will leave because of these issues. Here's how they viewed the church: hypocritical, focused too much on converting people, anti-homosexual, too political, too judgmental. So I see people deconstructing not because of Jesus, but they're deconstructing over some of those issues. And some of those are true. And some of them aren't bad. But what's your take on David's, thought on that?
So a few things. That was on probably millennials, probably 12 years ago.
It was on millennials. That's why I'm saying, but I think Gen Zs would maybe have some of that too, maybe.
So just yesterday, I saw the newest volume 3 of Barna's study on Gen Z.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, I read all that stuff.
And the amount of, I don't remember the exact numbers, but less and less are going to church. Less are identifying as Christians. That's no big surprise. Right. But over 70% had a positive impression of the church. Yeah, I didn't sense, at least from this study, this massive amount of angst and upset and disappointment with the church. A lot of them just aren't churched. That's a piece of it. True. Now, they did say that 46% of Gen Zers have some kind of doubts about what they believe, and that includes Christian kids. Yeah. So doubt and questioning things, which makes sense. If I had it in the mid-90s, that was before social media, that was before YouTube, that was before Netflix and all these other things. Now, the key point that I think is still really relevant from this research from Kinnaman is when you ask a lot of people why they deconstruct, they'll say contradictions in the Bible. They'll say, I don't think Jesus is God, evolution, whatever it is. Right. But when you probe down more deeply, the intellectual questions play a piece in it. Yeah. But rarely is it the main piece. Right. And I found sometimes that's emotional hurt. Right. Sometimes that's relational brokenness. Right. I think in many cases, people didn't really even understand what the gospel was and is. Right. And so Kinnaman's research was about how non-Christians view Christians. Those are outsiders. Yes. But when you talk to Christians who've left their faith, you'll get a little bit of a different scenario.
No, it's interesting. I was just talking, and I appreciate that, and I agree. And I've got to go get that Barna, the latest Barna, because what Barna does in their research with Gen Z is so helpful, because we've got to understand. I tell parents all the time, you've got to become students of the culture. You don't have to agree with the culture, and you don't have to agree with your kids, but you've got to be students of the culture. And I think that's a great place, as well as what you're doing. SeanMcDowell.org, by the way, is where you can learn a lot of good stuff. I want to dig down on one other. We're in kind of a political season, and at Homeward we never talk about politics. If I talked about politics and I said, here's what I'm voting for, I lose half my audience because half are this way and half are that. But and so it's not my thing.
Then maybe you gain a new half you don't want.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, please, yes. But I have found some of these Christian, two of my kids went to Christian colleges, and I have found that a lot of them are just so hacked right now at the church and politics. And I see some of their friends wandering, not because of Jesus again, but because they're just hacked at, however the church treats politics. Any thought on that?
So two of the things that Kinnaman pointed out in that research that I think are particularly pointed today. One was how much the church is viewed as being anti-homosexual. Yeah. Now, when he wrote that and You Lost Me, that was long before a lot of the past 10, 12 years conversation.
So much.
Those who deconstructed, that tends to be a common piece that's there.
Yeah.
And he also said non-Christians view the church as being too political.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. That's interesting, because I think I hear a lot of parents say, I had an experience with somebody not too long ago where they said, so I'm kind of shunning my son right now because he doesn't vote the way we vote. And I went, wait a minute. I said, are you telling me that in the next, somebody's going to get elected here pretty quick, and they're going to be there for, say, 4 years, could be 8 if it was a Democrat.
Sure.
But you're telling me that you're going to shun your child, which is a lifelong relationship and a gift from God, because you don't agree on politics? Seriously, these people are going to be gone and you won't remember their name. I can't remember who was president when I was like 9. It's terrible to say. I probably can if I went back hard enough, but I don't. And what you're telling me is you're going to do that. And it shocked them. I think they didn't accept it. I think they actually were mad at me, and that's okay, because that happens. But I think we have to be, I think they're shocked sometimes that they have a different, even political stand or things like that. But I want to move on. You mentioned the word social media, and actually you talking about you going, on that worldwide internet, it's so new. Al Gore invented that, didn't he, in 1984? Whatever. But the point being, that's where people go. And yet today, social media is affecting, talk about the homosexual issues, things like that. It's just affecting. So culture is affecting social media. In your mind, how much does that play into people today deconstructing their faith?
Well, the first thing I would say is since 1972, the research shows, and this comes from Christian Smith's recent book with Oxford on Handing on the Faith,
so good,
that the single most influence in the life of a young person is the parents. Yeah. It's not the educational system. Right. It's not social media. Yeah. And so it's natural for us to put the blame elsewhere. And a lot of that blame rests. Right. But I encourage parents to first say, what influence do I have? Do I leverage that well? Right. I think bottom line, simply put, if you want to pass in your faith, do 3 things. Number 1 is you got to live a faith worth emulating.
Right.
Second, build relationships with your kids. Third, have spiritual conversations about issues that matter, not lectures. Yeah. Now, of course, social media is very quick to step in and speak lies into kids. Yeah. And so that does play a role, especially when you see kids, we've seen in the rapid onset gender dysphoria issue.
Yes.
There's a lot of factors at play.
Right.
A big factor at play is social media.
Right.
And that's only one issue.
Right.
So yes, it's important. And that's why I actually think most kids want to have boundaries. Studies show this. And 2 of my 3 kids are Gen Zers. The other one's Gen Alpha. Is that if you have reasonable boundaries and you hold them to it and you state why, most will be okay with it. Yeah. But for different reasons, I think one reason is we just don't want to fight the battles as parents. Right. So we just fine, do it. No. And then it starts to seep in and profoundly affect not only the worldview, but the mental health. And the way I word it is I actually think social media in many ways is discipling our kids.
Yeah.
And I use that word intentionally. Wow. Probably more. If I was concerned about my kids spiritually, am I more concerned about rabid atheists that are out there like the new atheists or the social media impact? Probably a lot more so with social media than some of those voices.
No, that's fascinating. And we're trying to do so much here at Homeward where we're interviewing people who are authorities on this and not just, we don't want to hear the ones who go, it's Satan, never let your kids see it. That's not going to work. It's how do we create media safe homes and whatnot. I love that. The other thing you said that I think is so interesting, and this is my song, research shows that if kids do have faith conversations at home that aren't toxic, lecture-y, preachy, that there is a much greater chance they'll stay in the church. Amen. And we're seeing research. Barna does a little of this. Richard Ross, I don't know if you know him. He's that he's a professor out of Fort Worth, Texas, has done some amazing research showing that if we just have faith conversations where it's kind of natural. I was laughing. I have a grandson who's 9, James. He's named after me. And we always pray when we're in the car. We pray if there's a siren. And so a couple of days ago, I'm driving and there's a siren, but I forget to pray with him. And James goes, Papa Jay, you didn't pray. Like he's preaching at me. You didn't pray. But those are really the kinds of things that you begin to instill with kids. Well, listen, we're going to take a really quick break. I told you, This is amazing. Sean McDowell is with us. I knew this conversation would be great. All things Sean McDowell are at seanmcdowell.org. We also have all the show notes and all the information. I actually just love this podcast, so we'll be right back. Hi, Jim Burns here from Homeward. There are so many great things happening at the Homeward Ministries. And you know what? The greatest thing is my new friend, Marcus Preciado, who is our new president, an incredible leader with great vision. And he's going to tell you a little bit about some of the new things.
Thanks, Jim. Everyone, so excited about what God has for us here at Homeward, and thank you for being a part of it as well. To give you a sneak peek of what's coming next year and beyond, we're going to be expanding our podcast team, bringing new voices and new faces. We're very excited about that as well. Also, Homeward Hubs. We're going to have feet on the ground in every region of the United States so we can have hands-on ministry and take Homeward to the nation, as well as establishing Project Homeward, which is going to be a resource like no other to help families succeed. So thank you for being supportive. Thank you for being part of our community. And as this year is ending, I want to encourage you to pray about generosity and being a part of what Homeward's doing, and we can partner together to help families succeed.
Welcome back. What a great conversation today with Dr. Sean McDowell. We're talking about deconstruction and how we can help our kids if they are being deconstructed. But I want to bring up another thing. In your book, you talked about deconversion, and you mentioned it at the beginning. And we actually have a mutual friend who deconverted. In your book, you talk about his name. We're not going to, because I am very close to the family, and I'll just put it on the side. But you basically went through a story. And I think parents need to hear this story because some of their kids are either being deconverted, different than deconstruction, or they're literally, they've lost hope. The parents have lost hope because the kids are really articulate. This particular guy is one of the most articulate people I've ever known. And when he started talking to me about this, I was blown away by the thought process, but also now the lifestyle choices and things like that. So talk about, in the book, again, in the book set Adrift, you talked about his deconversion experience. That's happening all over the place.
Oh, yeah. We're hearing that story a lot. This individual in particular, I remember when I heard it, I was in tears, Jim.
Yeah.
This is someone who's been a friend for a long time, and his dad had an influence on me. And that was one of the first stories. I'd always, in the Bible, there's people who leave the faith. It's not like it's really a new phenomenon. Right. But if someone who, spoke at Biola when I was there, looked up to him, had a huge influence on my life. And I remember a buddy of mine called, and it was like time stopped. And so these are personal stories, and they hit us. It's one thing when it's a number. Right. It's another thing when it's a friend and a child and a mentor and a colleague. These stories are all over the place. Yeah. And I think what social media has done is it not only gives people a platform to tell these stories, but encourages it now. You've got to tell your story. You've got to reveal it to the world. And those kind of dramatic stories get more play than somebody who just questions but stays in the faith versus someone who questions and leaves.
And you see it with kind of the Christian celebs who have left. You see that in the music industry. There's some Christian celebs in the music industry have gone that same direction.
But I think what happens is there's somewhat of a selection effect. It feels like everybody's deconverted. And I go, for everyone who deconverts, there's 100 faithful pastors and youth pastors who are just doing the work, and they don't, no one's paying attention to them, but they're just doing what the Lord called them to. It's important to keep that in balance.
Right. When somebody says they don't believe anymore, they claim to be an atheist, twice as many atheists in Gen Z, as even with millennials, so says Barna. What do you, as a parent, you hear your kid do this, what do you do with that? How do you help your son or your daughter, or how do you embrace them? What do you do, in your opinion?
So earlier you mentioned just agreeing with my dad's response to me when I was questioning things. One of the brilliant things that he did is he anticipated all the conceivable conversations that my sisters and I might have with him. If my sister goes, "Dad, I'm pregnant," or if I said, "Dad, I'm dropping out of college," and whatever it is. Right. And he had thought through, how would I respond if one of my kids said I'm questioning my faith? And I think that just gave him a certain grace and perspective to respond in that moment. So the time is now to think it could happen, not to live in fear, but just to say, to lean in. This is an opportunity. And so I just encourage parents to just say things like, "Guy, thanks for sharing that with me. I can't imagine how difficult it was for you to tell your parents who brought you to church and lived this way. Tell me the backstory. I want to understand, and I want to be a part of this journey with you. Lean in, build relationship, focus on the love. Don't feel at that point, I wouldn't say, well, you haven't read more than a carpenter. Read this book and get back to me. That is not, you can maybe get there in due time if they're open to it.
No, exactly.
I mean, some kids are at the point where they're like, I'm questioning my faith, but I'm open to coming back. Others have made up their mind, and at least that point, they're not coming back. At least that's what they think. I want to know, how long has this happened? What's your state? How can I love you through this? I mean, just humble yourself, ask questions, ensure the relationship, and take a longer term perspective.
No, it's really good. And I think a lot of times what happens is when people, they say, I don't believe, but then they lack community, and they go back to, where was my best community?
Oh, man.
And it's church. And so they may not be coming back because there's a really great speaker at the church or a pastor. They might be coming back just because they are lonely and they want community. And I think that's something that we miss. So as a family, we still accept them. We still love them. We still embrace them. I had to tell a parent the other day, you can't be a one-topic parent. I know your kid has walked away from faith, but you can't be a one-topic parent. Expand the relationship. You still have they like the Dodgers. Go to a Dodger game. Do these kinds of things with your son, because you can't just, in some ways, the dad wasn't trying to shun the kid, but the dad was kind of doing that because he just was so mad, or every time he was with him, he only talked about that. No, expand it, because, I've said things. I'm strong about this. And then, 2 years later, I go, I guess I'm not as strong about that as I used to be. Well, that's kids too.
I would encourage a couple things. I'd encourage parents to get to the point, and this is easier said than done, of just saying, if I could rewind the clock, what do you wish I'd maybe done differently?
Good. It's a great question.
And that can be painful because they might say things that hurt, but that shows a level of humility. I made mistakes and I recognize it. I want to do better moving forward. I want to know what it means to love you. Another question is, during this season, in your mind, and I might see it differently, what do you think it looks like for me to love you during this season? So, just at least ask that. But you're right about community. I had a student who was in my Bible class, and we went on apologetic mission trips, and all of a sudden I find out he's an atheist, and I was like, okay, something happened. Let's go to coffee. We went twice, and it was pretty clear to me what he did is he went to the university. He's like, I just need to shut everybody out and study the evidence myself. Came out that it shows that atheism is true. And after we talked, I realized he has his mind made up. He's not open. The last thing I said is, I said, you sound like a committed atheist. If you come to the point where you ever start to question that, will you at least let me be a part of the conversation?
Love it.
That was it. And shake my hand, agree on it. And he shook my hand.
Yeah. And a lot of times an experience happens or something takes place.
Right.
I have an older brother who's now passed away, but, he became a Christian I was in the room with him. I kind of led him to the Lord. I actually went through a 4 spiritual loss. I'm like, where do you get these anymore? And I went online and, and I went through this with him. And so it was right at the end of his life.
Wow.
He was sad that he didn't do that earlier, but, you just never know. I mean, I'm not talking about, deathbed conversions, but, one of the things I see, Sean, with people, a lot of this younger generation is they don't have as much of a problem with Jesus. I don't see them hacking on Jesus that much. And they don't agree with everything he says, but in your book, Set Adrift, you said Jesus, his identity, you've got to get that right, and that's crucial. Talk about the identity, who Jesus is. Why is that so important to somebody going through something like that? You're
right about that, and that's true worldwide. This is another Barna study. I think it's the largest study they ever did, maybe 2-3 years ago. Worldwide. And it was, they called Gen Zers. I mean, we're talking Latin America, we're talking Asia, the Middle East, the open generation. And a willingness to engage things about Jesus. That's what I sense with Gen Zers as well today. Cool. Everybody kind of wants Jesus on their team. He's cool. We sing songs about him. There's not a lot of people that are anti-Jesus. But at its core, Jesus didn't just claim to be a prophet. He didn't just claim to be a religious leader. He claimed to be God.
Right. And this gets into what you talk about in more than a carpenter.
That's exactly right. Like he didn't, C.S. Lewis famously says he didn't leave it open to us, just call him a good moral leader. And so I think it's appropriate to just say to people, and I've framed it with students, I said, look, it's clear that Jesus had a greater influence on the world and governments and music and art and architecture and politics than anyone who's ever lived.
No doubt.
And Jesus said the biggest question is, who do you say that I am?
Yeah.
Who do you really think he was?
Right.
And why?
Right.
That's
Great
the
question.
root question, because then downstream is, okay, what did Jesus view about sexuality?
Yes.
What did Jesus view about the scriptures?
Right.
What did he think about hell? What did he think about eternal life? Those are downstream from whether he has the authority to know these things and speak truth.
Yeah.
And that's the heart of the conversation we want to have.
As you're talking about that, I was thinking back to a part in your book where you talked about the authority of Scripture, God's Word. And you kind of said there was a historical view and a progressive view. Help us understand the two different views that you wrote about.
So we're not talking politics here in this book. Again, definitely not progressive politics.
No.
What we're talking about is kind of what you might call a historic Christian faith and what's increasingly referred to as progressive Christianity. Even within progressive Christianity, there's debates and differences. But part of the point is everybody has some authority that they point to.
Right.
It might be the self, which is big today.
Right.
You do you, live your truth, etc.
Yeah.
It might be something that's in culture. It might be my feelings.
Yeah.
Everybody has a sense of authority. And I think at the root of the split between historic Christian faith is Jesus, God the Father, ultimate authority as expressed in Scripture. So Scripture has authority.
Yeah.
Progressive Christians tend to bring in something else. Well, my feelings, a different definition of love, some other authority that starts to conflict with the Scriptures. And then my view of love trumps what the Scripture says about marriage. Hence, I need to reinterpret these passages.
Yeah, and what's interesting when you say that is one of my beefs is that sometimes it's what they heard 2 weeks ago from a YouTube video or a TikTok video that went for 45 seconds, and they changed. It's a cultural input, and so they changed their belief system for that. And I realize we're going through experimental phases, but I think that's so important. I wrote a book recently, and you actually endorsed it, and I appreciate that, on A Student's Guide to Sexual Integrity. One of the chapters was on culture, gender, and authority. And my point is, are you going to listen to the loud voice of culture, or are you going to look at the master designer who's, the master designer of our sexuality? And I think some people throw that out because the culture is so loud. I'm dying because I got to stop because it's gone too fast. We got to bring you back. You're a neighbor, so I got to get you back in here because we could go on and on. I actually have more questions, but we'll do this another time. But before we go, I want to talk to you for just a second on the YouTube channel, as well as listening on the various podcast things. I want to talk just a little bit more about deconstruction. I read a book last week by a woman who is actually going to become my editor of a new book I have called When Your Adult Child Strays, You Can't Want It More Than They Want It, and she's awesome. And in her book, her book is called Faith and Other Flat Tires. She didn't even use the word deconstruction because back then she didn't even know the word. But she described this, and I want to give you this script. It's a lot, actually, not a little, but a lot of what Sean was just talking about. She has 8 steps to her deconstruction and coming back. This is hopeful for you parents. Grow up in a Christian church. She was actually a missionary kid, and then she moved to Spokane, Washington. Go off to college away from said church. Be exposed to the enticements of the secular life, and that happens. We drift because sometimes we just, we don't focus on our stuff, and so we start drifting, and we need to make a course correction. She didn't. What she did was she said, try drugs and cigarettes and Pearl Jam. I think that is the funniest line. I teased her about it yesterday. And then leave church because of the so-called worldly enticements. Then it says, experience epiphany, realize emptiness of secular things, return to the church with a penitent heart, and reestablish faith, discovering good living. And I went, that can be the case even for your kids if they're somewhere on that journey. And there is a journey, and some kids are forfeiting their spiritual purpose, but that doesn't have to happen. And your job is to do what really the loving father did in the story of the prodigal son, but I rather call it the loving father. He didn't give the son more money when he returned, but he said, this is my son and I'm going to love him. And that's the thing we have to do. Because I want to say something to you. The question that kids ask when they're violating values or they're deconstructing their faith is, as a parent, I'm looking you right in the eye if you're on the YouTube channel, do you still love me? And that's critical, because that love of a parent, don't downplay that. Even when you're frustrated or you're angry or you're like in shock because they're doing some pretty silly things. But the question they're asking is, do you still love me in the midst of me violating your values? That's key. I'm going to close with this quote. It's by Madeleine Engel, and it's like my new favorite quote for a while. We draw people to Christ not by loudly discrediting what they believe, by telling them how wrong they are and how right we are, but by showing them a light that is so lovely that they want with all their hearts to know the source of it. And I think that's kind of our job. And that's hard because we want to show grace. There's also a time when we need to say, I'm not really believing what you're believing. And you got to tell them, here's what I believe. Here's why I believe it. But then also you got to show that love. So again, thanks to Sean McDowell. What a privilege to have him here in the studio. And at Homeward, if we can be of any help to you, go to homeword, WORD.com. And we got lots of great stuff that really helps in this area. And then also go to SeanMcDowell.org. You will be blown away by the incredible resources that he has. So I'm Jim Burns, and you've just listened to Homeward.